All right, here we are.
Yeah.
Hi, Dave.
What's up, Brendan?
Welcome.
And any tardiness is all my fault. I saw somebody in the chat room. They're like, "Hey, he's 2 minutes late." I'm like, "That's my fault." So.
Well, I wasn't going to say it, but if you're going to, I was just saying to Dave right before we got on here that I was like, we should have done a Zoom call or something where everyone could actually be participating and see faces and have a conversation. So I apologize about that. We'll get better. Dave is the expert here, so I probably shouldn't have even done all the technical scheduling in the first place. But I thought today would be fun to. We've got all the comments and questions being asked, and if you have any questions or anything like that, we're gonna probably talk for a few minutes and then just open it up to questions or discussion. And again, sorry, it's text-based, but we'll flag people's questions, so feel free to ask whatever you want during our chat. All right, so I am so unbelievably excited for this week. Well, Dave started last week, so I was really excited for last week. I've been excited for the whole month since we started talking about this. I wrote a blog post about it, but in the age of right now, reading blog posts isn't necessarily what everyone does. So I'm going to just sort of reiterate the story a little bit about how this came to be. And so I'll have a little monologue for a minute and we can chat. But it's so funny to think back over the past 4 years. So I started writing code for Podpage around holidays of 2019. And I think I had something, maybe it was right in beginning of 2020, but I had something to show people. I remember around February. And I built it because a friend of mine had a podcast and he didn't have a website. And I was just like, why would you not have that piece of presence on the web? And he said, well, it's too hard. WordPress is a pain in the butt. And I just, I release episodes all the time. I don't want to have to keep it up to date. He had tried to use some plugins, but it had broken. So he just basically pointed everyone to Apple and Spotify, really just Apple at the time. And I was like, well, let me see what I can build in a weekend. And in 1 weekend, once I learned about the RSS feed, I was like, oh, I'll build a site that generates itself and keeps it up to date. So I did that as a favor. And then enough other podcasters saw that and said, I kind of want one. And it was around March, April, where I said, maybe there's something here that I could offer to the market, and it would be something that they would want. I immediately, because I didn't know podcasting too well, I immediately tried to reach out to people. I talked to Ray Ortega, I think, was the first person or one of the first people. Yeah. And when I was asking him, I was like, who should I talk to? And he gave me a list of people, and Dave Jackson was on that list. And so I went to Dave's site and I was like, oh my God, this guy is sort of like, he clearly is a legend in the space. Everyone seeks him out for education. Like, I should put a strategy in place where I could actually find a time to meet this person, because he's probably way too busy to just respond to an email. And then I saw a booking link on his site for consulting. And so it was really more geared towards podcasters, but I sort of faked myself in and said, I don't have a podcast, but I have something podcasters might like. Would you be willing to chat with me? So we talked, I think, for 15 minutes or maybe 30 minutes. I can't remember what it was. But Dave was one of the first people I showed the product to. And I said, am I crazy to think that this is something people would value? And we had this awesome, I can't remember the specific details, but we had this awesome conversation around the market, what was out there, what was needed, and basically just like was able to start soaking in a ton of feedback. Then I can't remember the first time I came onto School of Podcasting, but it was about 2 months later, I think. So I think I went back into my hole, fixed a bunch of problems and things that David raised, and then went on to School of Podcasting. And since then, Dave has been just basically an amazing independent collaborator, and been able to funnel back feedback he's getting from his students to me about what is great about Podpage, what sucks about Podpage. I don't know. We've done a lot of great work just as far as like getting feedback, as Dave being an independent person that's been helping. The shirt he's wearing, the Podpage shirt, is basically the only Podpage shirt in existence that he made on his own, because he's been teaching a Podpage class. And so anyway, it's been awesome to have someone who knows so much about the space, who knows so much about both the technology side and the podcasting side, who is so well respected in the industry, helping. And so I've been very grateful for that over the past 4 years. And as I started to think about 2 or 3 months ago, I started thinking, all right, like we've always done great customer support, and what I try to do is I do all the design and most of the engineering. So the area that I felt like has never really been great has been education. Because as I've gotten busier working on the product, I've had less time to do webinars and one-on-one education. I started basically building this whole role, and I sent Dave a Loom video. I was out on a walk, and I was just like, Dave, like, here's the dream job that I would love to fill. Is there any chance that you'd be interested in this? And that conversation led to this. So we sort of worked on it. So I'm so excited to welcome Dave as head of podcasting. What does that mean? Obviously, Podpage is all about podcasting. So what does head of podcasting mean? It really is like everything to do with making sure podcasters have an unbelievable experience using Podpage. And so that splits itself into helping make decisions and recommendations about the product itself. How can this product be more helpful for podcasters based on experience and also what they're saying? It's educating podcasters on how to use the product. And so anyone who's ever has tried to use the sort of onboarding welcome to Podpage videos in the past year has realized they're all based on a dashboard that we replaced last year. So it's not great. So updating our new user help content, updating our help content, actually supporting users with email and chat, which is how we communicate. Big thing that users have always wanted who get really stuck is, can we just get on a Meet link or a Zoom link and just talk through this problem? We've never been able to offer that. Now we can start offering it. And then coaching in general of just being able to, hey, you're a podcaster on Podpage. We want you to be a successful podcaster. That helps you. That helps us. So how can you be more successful? And so starting to offer time with Dave. That's just some of the early stuff. Obviously, Dave still is going to be representing us at all these conferences that he's constantly at. And there's just so much more, but that's kind of like the first week. So anyway, I am over the moon about this and very optimistic about this being an amazing thing for podcasters using Podpage and not. But welcome, Dave. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Brendan wants to know, or I'm sorry, that's your Brendan. Jammin wants to know, how does he get a hat? We need to start a Podpage, apparently a Podpage clothing line. People talking about that. Yeah, one of the things that I just thought was amazing is I remember you said, well, what do they need? And I really didn't make a long list. Like, they need an about page, they need a contact page, they need an easy way to get their episodes on there, and that's about it. And maybe integrate their email list. And it was just like, oh, like this. And I was like, yes. He's like, what else could they do? And it was like, every time I'd give you, well, it'd be cool if it did this, like this. Yes. So, which is why I always tell people that's how you build a podcast. Figure out what your audience wants and then go make it. And so it just kept getting better and better. Like, what if it integrated with Patreon like this? Yes, that would be great. So I'm looking forward to and again, nothing against my previous employer. This is just what I love to do. So when I get to make tutorials and I get to update the documentation and videos and interact with you guys. And, if you need a quick live call, we can do that now. And so that's the part I love, just integrating with all the podcasters out there. Cause the wider view we have of what you folks are up to, the more we can go, ooh, what if it did this? So.
Yeah. I think that, that's actually, you've said a couple things to touch on there. One is, the stuff that you love is not necessarily stuff that I don't love, but stuff that I'm not particularly great at. I can write tutorials and I can do that, but it's not nearly at the level of yours. And so whenever you hire someone, you're always hoping to hire someone who's better than you at the thing that you're looking to bring someone on for and smarter than you about that area. And I think obviously Dave is miles ahead of me there. And I think it's going to be really beneficial because we were talking yesterday, I'm working on a new dashboard that hopefully we'll release at least into beta in the next week. And my ask to Dave was like, please go around this dashboard and tell me where you get stuck or you're wondering like, why does this work this way? So I think that like having a critical eye, and Dave is so nice. He's like, well, hey, I kind of didn't know where this was, but I think I found it. And I was like, no, I want you to tell me this is horrible. I need to change it. Because you have a much, I don't want to have to like do a video about how to use this feature. I just want the feature to be so good that the video is about why the feature is valuable, not like here's how to find it randomly throughout the dashboard. So I'm very excited because I think it's going to level up all of that part of the education, both inside the product and also outside the product. But the other big thing is like watching Dave work at Libsyn, but also and be a great representative of Libsyn, but also not be sort of a delusioned person where he couldn't say anything nice about Libsyn's competitors. I feel like that was a big thing for me, because my biggest fear with bringing Dave on, and I think I said this in that initial video, is like, I'm terrified because you're one of our best ambassadors. And I'm like, I'm taking this expert who is impartial and being like, well, he's not impartial anymore. And obviously we lose that, right? No one's going to trust. A lot of people won't trust that you're being impartial. But it was important to me to see you be impartial when it came to hosting, and be like, cool, you can still tell us that this stinks. You can still tell us the competitors are better. You can still like have that critical eye. Even 8 years into your old job, you were still able to do that. And I think that takes a lot, because most people just sing the praises of wherever they work, and they stop seeing that there are better solutions out there. And it's really important for me that we still can make the best product. And that part of that is knowing where we aren't good.
Yeah, I always try to explain my answer. So if I say, Podpage is the best, and people are like, okay, you're only, and I'm like, well, I just paid $199 for a year of WordFence, because I still have one website on WordPress, mainly because I have clients that still use WordPress. So I can't completely abandon WordPress, because somebody's going to go, I have this plugin that's not updated. And I'm like, So I had to pay for WordFence. And then by the time I paid for a decent media host, and then I throw in, oh yeah, that really cool plugin that's, whatever, $40 a year. And this one's $60 a year. And that one's $10 a year. Okay, now I've got the perfect website. By the time you add all that stuff up, oh wait, I forgot I got to have a backup for WordPress, because, I don't want that white screen of death. I'm like, okay, here's what I pay for WordPress. Here's what I pay for Podpage. Oh, by the way, I just moved media host in my WordPress site. My players didn't update. They're still showing the old, like I have 900 episodes that if I were to actually leave that media host would die, because I have to manually change them. I have another website on Podpage. I changed media hosts and it's perfectly fine. I didn't have to, I changed the feed. I was like, did the redirect. It was like, and we're done. I was like, Brendan, like, what do I have to do in Podpage? He's like, oh, it should be done. And I literally went to the website and it's like, wow, there's the new players. So I just go, this is why I think what I think. And if somebody goes, yeah, but, well, we're always willing to hear any kind of, but does it do this or that? So we're always looking to make Podpage better. But I just kind of go, here's what I did. Make your decision based on what I did, and feel free to get a second opinion. But so
that's a good example of, there's a lot of places in the product itself that, after spending 4 years toiling away at this, there's a lot of clever things that it does that do solve problems. But I spend all the time trying to solve the problem, and I don't actually spend time explaining that we've solved the problem. And so you still have people like Dave, or a lot of our users, coming and being like, hey, I'm changing media hosts. Like, this is going to screw everything up. And we can say, oh, no, we've taken care of that. But it probably should just communicate that better in the product, right? When you go to your feed area, it says, hey, if you change your feed, here's all the great stuff we're going to do. And we don't. And I think that, part of my big excitement and ask for Dave is like, the product should just answer all the questions. There's a, this is a little complex area. Well, we should link to the help video that Dave made in the product, not make them go to the support documentation, find the article, find a video in the article, or have to search Google or YouTube for it. Like, we should spoon feed the information needed where it's needed. And so, it's going to be helpful for that kind of stuff too, because ultimately the goal is to just, like, there's some podcasters that really want to be very active on their website and to be publishing things, blog posts and other stuff. And that's fine. Everyone has their own goals, but the goal with Podpage is always that you set it up and that it just does everything you need it to do without needing to think about it. It imports your reviews, it imports your episodes, it uses your media host player on your episode page. It pulls in stuff from YouTube. And if you've set it up, you can put your YouTube videos automatically on your episode page that correspond to the same episode. Like, we want to make it as smart as possible, so you can just do your podcast and not have to think about your web presence. Anyway, so, a lot of it is just communicating all the things that we do very well that most people don't know about. I can't remember what it was. There was some feature, I think it was importing videos from YouTube, that someone asked me if we did that. I launched that feature over 2 years ago, I think. Someone about 2 months ago asked me about it. And I was like, why are you asking this question? I realized we never put it on the marketing page or wrote any documentation about it. So once you signed up, got in, you saw like a video link that you could then figure out. But if you were evaluating Podpage as a potential product, didn't even know that feature existed. 2 years. That's because, I moved on immediately to build other stuff. So
yeah, you're like, all right, done, and on to the next. And those are the things. We're still batting around some ideas on making a Podpage podcast, just to do things like that. Hey, here's this new feature. Here's what it does. Here's how you do it, that whole 9 yards. And so we're still battling, kind of like figuring out exactly what we're going to cover with that. And is it going to be we'll put something out when we have something to say schedule or things like that. So we're still kind of, that one's still in the oven baking a little bit, which is good. And so that will be coming in the future, as well as videos on YouTube and all sorts of fun stuff. And Harry Duran says Podpage office hours. Yep. Those are here.
That actually might. So Harry, we just published this in the Podpage dashboard. If you go to help, there's a button now for live support. And it's funny, office hours is we should just change the name to office hours, because we have this, we've always done live support, meaning if you go to Podpage, you look for support, we're there chatting with you in relatively short amount of time. Sometimes it is live because we're on the other side and we can be chatting, or, we get back to you within an hour. So we started thinking like, well, what do we call it when you can actually talk to us on Zoom and actually have that? Well, I guess that's live support, but the other thing is live support. Office hours, that's a good term to use for either the webinar or the live support. Because we've been trying to figure out, like, we want to offer more opportunity for you all to be able to just ask a question to a person, and the person is there listening and then answers it, and other people can listen in. So like I said, we're going to do weekly webinar. Dave will host like a little demo of Podpage and then a Q&A. And that could be for one person or 100 people. Whoever signs up can sign up. And then there's one-on-one sessions. And so we'll have to figure out what to call it to make it as useful as possible.
Yeah, Chris wants to know if we have a community that exists currently. And we do. It's in Facebook right now.
Yeah. I think if you go to podpage.com/community, it'll redirect you to our Facebook community, which is kind of like a Facebook version of a place to ask questions to everyone else. And Dave and I were talking about this, I think, yesterday, sort of like, well, what should that community be? What should that grow into? Should it be more generalized podcasting help? Should it be stick to Podpage? And so we're still figuring that one out.
Yeah, it's one of those things. When I was in a band, we called it the Skinnerd effect. I was in a country band, and if somebody asked us to play Skinnerd, we're like, we had our criteria. In the same way that Podpage is like, no, we're a website. We're not going to be a media host. And in the band, it was like, we're a country band, and if it wasn't in the top 10, then we weren't going to play it, because if you play Skinnerd, you're one step away from playing the Doors. And at that point, you're just a classic rock band. So you have to figure out not only what you want to be, but also what you're not going to be. And so we're still kind of baking that idea forward, but it'll be fun. But the Facebook group right now is, you'll see we post links to our blogs and things like that in there, and people ask questions, and it's a great way to thank you, Chris Stone, that made me laugh. Free bird. Yeah. So it'll be big fun place just to hang out, and we're going to kind of make that one up as we go along. We all know, as I look in the chat room, we got a lot of OGs in here. We got Harry Duran and all sorts of people. And it's one of those where we know what we don't want it to be, right? New episode is out, live streaming from, well, you can't live stream into Facebook anymore, at least groups, but we know what we don't want it to be. So we'll just keep using that as a criteria for now.
Well, and also, like, seeing Chris's question. So when I started Podpage, I set up a Slack group, and anyone who joined Podpage could join the Slack group. And I was there all the time. We were chatting. And what I found was that a lot of people just didn't check Slack that often. So it was like sort of dead on the wire immediately. Like, I got, there were hundreds of people in there, but no one was ever in there talking to each other. Now it might be interesting to look into something like that. again. But I moved to Facebook because I was like, well, the cool thing about Facebook is if there's a group in Facebook and people are talking, when someone logs into Facebook, they'll see the updates just as they're like looking for family photos too, right? So people tended to see stuff more. I don't actually know if I agree with that now, 4 years later. So maybe, I know, Dave, you mentioned Heartbeat. Like I would love to have like a place where people could go and actually feel like there was a community talking to each other all the time. But so we're, again, this is the cool thing is like, I basically in the last few years, I've had, Chris, you might say that, and I might think like, oh, what's a good thing to do for that? And then I'd think about it for an hour, and then some fire would happen, and I'd have to go put that out, and then I'd be off to something else. And having Dave to be able to like really focus on figuring out how do we mobilize the community in the best way possible is great. One thing, just before I forget, Daniel J. Lewis just jumped in and said, so glad that you got Dave. It's a match made in RSS heaven. To give credit where it's due, in that initial list of 3 or 4 people, Daniel J. Lewis I booked time with him, and he gave me an enormous amount of feedback on the product at the beginning. So he was another integral like person that I learned a ton from. And I think if I can remember correctly, I think his podcast, the Audacity to Podcast, had more content about podcast websites than I could find from anywhere else. And I remember I was driving, I was on like a 2 or 3 hour road trip, and I was listening, and it was right around the time I was trying to come up with Podpage. And obviously, if you're going to build a podcast website service, you should figure out what's out there already and what's good and bad about it. And that episode that he did, it was probably 5 years old now, about podcast websites, was amazing because he was like, here's how to set up a podcast website. And it was WordPress, because that was kind of the only thing. And it was, here's how to set it up. And I remember on the console of the car, I was taking notes. And the notes I was taking was, okay, because I think it was like a 10-step process. And it was like, first, get a free WordPress. Now you need to pay for hosting. So I'd write down, and he was like, no, hosting is $5 to $10 or a month or whatever. And I would write that down. He's like, you should probably use Pretty Links, but you really should use Pretty Links Pro. If you get super serious, that's, I don't know, $60 a month or $60 a year. All these numbers are wrong probably. But I just remember writing down his step-by-step process to build a Podpage or podcast website and totaling up the amount of money that the free WordPress site was. And it ended up being, I think it was like $200 to $300 a year, something like that. And I was like, wow, that's surprising, because you would think that this stuff, people go to WordPress because it's free, but it ends up, you have to plug in a lot of other stuff to make it really a good experience. And so, Yoast SEO, all that stuff. And so it was so helpful to me to kind of be like, okay, I can kind of benchmark like how much WordPress is. Plus you have to hire a designer. You have to learn a ton. And it really was so helpful to me to be like, okay, if I can just make the whole thing simpler and bake all this stuff in and not have plugins, break because there was an upgrade, this could be better. It could be a alternative solution. And I've always said, like, Podpage is far less customizable than WordPress. And if you're someone who wants the utmost design customizations, like I always tell people to go to WordPress because it's better when it comes to design customizations, but it's simpler in a lot of other ways. So anyway, but Daniel Lewis's podcast initially was such a big inspiration for it.
Yeah, the Podcasters Roundtable was in the house because I think you said Ray Ortega was the guy that pointed you towards me, and then Daniel J. Lewis. So there you've got the Podcasters Roundtable, which I'm trying to bug Ray to bring that back. I miss hanging out with those guys. I still hang out with Daniel on the future of podcasting, but Floyd has can I show these? I can. Floyd says, I'm looking forward to this updated dashboard. The current one breaks my heart just a little.
Okay, so let me at least have a moment. So I love criticism because it helps make the product better. And I also hate the current dashboard, even though I'm the one who designed it. So I take your comment, Floyd, with an open mind and open heart. The inspiration. So here's what Podpage 4 years ago was like. On the left-hand side, it said like episodes, and the 4 things that Podpage does were just listed there. And then over the course of 3 years, or I guess probably 2.5 years at this point, that left panel started going off the screen. It was so intense because we added so much stuff to it. And the feedback I got from new users was, this seems really cool, but good Lord, I'm overwhelmed right now. Where do I start? And so a couple of years ago, year and a half ago, I guess about a year ago, I set out to say, all right, there's too much to do. I need to organize it in a certain way. And actually took some inspiration, very direct inspiration from ConvertKit, which had sort of grouped their features into tasks. So if you want to grow your audience, everything's under grow. If you want to earn money, everything's under earn, as opposed to the way I had it, which was just kind of randomly listed. So I moved the dashboard to feel a little bit more like the way the ConvertKit had done it. And I think I over-indexed because now everything's hidden in this top level navigation. And I am the creator, and it's been a year and I still have a hard time finding stuff. Right. And that's when you know it's bad. So about 2 months ago, started working on this problem, and hopefully the new one will be way simpler to find things. One of the big aha moments that I had sort of when I was really trying to put on fresh eyes and look at the product again was it's a website product, but it feels a lot like, I mean, it could be a media host. When you log into it after you've used it, you log into it and it just is like, here are your episodes, here's your blog posts. Like there's not like, this is a website. And then if you just want to like see your blog page, you have to go to your own website and hit blog. It's just, so the new dashboard has totally been redesigned to be centered around the core thing that Podpage is, which is a website. So when you log in, you'll see a list of your pages on your website, all of them. And there's a lot more than you probably know. There's like a page dedicated to voicemails. There's a page dedicated to, some of the more obscure ones of like leaving a review on your actual website is there now. And so there's just stuff that you kind of could find if you were looking for it, but now it's going to be just very much, here's your website, here are the pages, here's how to make them look different. And then here's other tools. So we're going to hopefully put it into beta. If you're in the Facebook community, you'll get it first. My target is for this week to start letting people kick the tires on it. So if you want to join the Facebook community, it's podpage.com/community. I'll post a link in there, hopefully Wednesday or Thursday. And you can start playing with it and telling me what's good about it and what's bad about it. Dave has been doing this for the past week, and he's raised some issues that definitely need to be resolved before we put it out there. But anyway, sorry, Floyd. It makes my heart cry a lot. Makes me cry a lot. So hopefully the new one's going to be way better.
Well, and the fun thing is I'm still learning things because I thought I knew Podpage. I mean, I made all the tutorials and stuff. And Madeline says, I love the YouTube feature. I didn't realize till this morning, Brendan filled me in that, because what happens is if you import your channel and maybe you don't want your shorts on your website, or if you delete a video from your website, the minute it goes back and syncs for more, it's going to bring that one back. So what you can do is make a playlist, which is super easy in YouTube. And then anything you want to go to Podpage, you just put in that playlist. And if you're doing the whole YouTube/YouTube music podcast, well, that's an easy one. Just use that playlist and import that into Podpage, and easy squeezy lemon pleasy, or however that went back in the day. You're good to go. So,
well, and that was, a couple of weeks ago. There's some things that I've done recently that we haven't announced because we'll just announce them all with the new dashboard. But that's one of them where the only option was we'd say like, what's your YouTube channel? And you'd give us that and we would import all of your videos. And now you can then there was this other more complex way to do it that I was going to start working on. And then most of the feedback I got from users was, I just want to import, I have all my podcast episodes in a playlist already. I just want to import the playlist. I don't want to import everything. And so now you can choose import my YouTube channel, which is everything, or import just one playlist. So it should work really well for everyone. We'll see. There's probably more complex use cases that will develop over time, but that's just one of those ones that came with user feedback. So,
and since everybody's here, this is always fun to do. We talked about our Facebook group. What is your preference for a community? I see we have 50 plus people here. So throw your vote in the comments if you like Facebook or Heartbeat. Easy for me to say, Heartbeat. Discord, I know a lot of people like that one. If you have a favorite community platform, it's something for us to chew on.
Well, I'd also love if you're going to write that in. Also, what about the current communities is like missing? Because same with the Podpage podcast that we're talking about doing. It's like, we don't want to do a Me Too thing where it's just like, okay, like Buzzsprout has an amazing Facebook community, really active. I think it's really, and so does Podcast Movement. They've got great Facebook groups. Like, what can we do that they're not doing? Because if they're doing it well, we'd rather spend time focusing on things that we can do really well that aren't being done. So, that's the same with the podcast. Dave and I are talking like, well, what's the Podpage podcast going to be that other ones aren't? Is it going to be a podcast about podcasting? Is it going to be a podcast about Podpage, or podcast about all podcast websites? Like, what content would people really want that's not out there already? I feel like one of the top reasons to pod fade is when you start realizing, well, my podcast isn't that different than other ones, and those other ones have been around longer, and so people are listening to those, and I think you have to offer something unique. So,
yeah, I'm listening to a book right now. If you feel so moved, you can read it. It's in multiple formats from Tom Webster, called "The Audience is Listening," and he says that is one of the hardest questions to answer: is what makes my podcast different than the other 5 shows about podcasting, things like that. So we're kind of taking that approach. Like, okay, we don't want to be pod news because James does that. We don't want to do this. So we're figuring out as we go along. Having a lot of votes in here. Thank you for your feedback on your favorite platforms. It's always fun because you have those people like Facebook all the way, and then other people like, Zuckerberg makes me want to, put a fork in my eye. And I'm like, well, we've come to the conclusion that we're not going to please everyone. So that's always fun. So
this group though has made me think maybe we should put a little time and effort into making some t-shirts and some hats for everyone.
Yeah.
And finding a way to offer those up without, my worry about doing anything is always like, is it going to be distracting? Is it something that enough people want where it's worth the distraction? And so we'll have to figure it out. I mean, there's easy ways to get t-shirts printed, but some of the on-demand ones are never the highest quality. I'd rather if we do something that's going to represent us well. So, but that's definitely, I feel like more people than I thought would be interested in merch, which is cool.
Well, just, I always say, I explain my why just to prove it. I'll put this up. And Tom is not paying me anything for this. Where did Tom Webster's? Here you go. Says, thanks so much for the show. I'm actually listening to the book right now on Audible, and it's got a great chapter on making one of those things, a survey for your audience. And he's got a bunch of stuff you can download. So the audience is listening. So Tom, you can, I don't know, buy me a coffee at Podcast Movement or something. But I love stuff that makes me think. Rob says we should do a live Q&A show with this exact show. Yes. It'll just be, there we go. We'll just do a webinar, edit out the boring stuff, take the 4 minutes that exists and put it out or something like that. So. Yeah.
Alex, you said hit me up. I'm texting you right now as a reminder.
Yeah. Summer says the podcast should be about connecting podcasters who have similar themes together for interesting discussions. That is one nice thing about Heartbeat. That's the tool I use for the School of Podcasting, and I haven't implemented it yet. Communities are they're not quite as easy as you think they are. And it has a feature where I could go in and say, I'm a sports podcaster. And then it could go in and say, I would like to be connected with other sports podcasters. And then behind the scenes, it somehow sends emails and connects people and things like that. So it's handy, but there are also people that are, the fun part is a lot of podcasters are introverts, and meeting new people is not their strong suit. So it's always this fun balance of what do you want to do? There you go. Chris Nessie has the title Podpage Community Corner with Brendan and Dave. So Alex says, I'd love to know more about merchandising and other ways to monetize podcasts.
Yeah. One thing I think that's an interesting, in the years that I've spent in this community, there's a lot of content about launching podcasts and getting your podcast off the ground, meaning literally I have an idea for a podcast. Here's how to get it onto Apple. Right. And there's obviously the approach of sign up for Spotify for podcasters, hit the record button, and that's the end of it. Right. I'm not talking necessarily about that part of it. I'm talking more I want to do it slightly more professional. What mic should I buy? There's there's a million guides about this. I think one thing that hasn't been talked about enough, and I've seen friends who focused on this as opposed to all the other stuff, was how do I get X amount of people to download my first episode? Right. I come from a tech industry background, and it was all about, okay, when we launch our product, you always can build it and they will come is not really a thing anymore. But if you're solving a real problem, you'll probably eventually get people to use it. But if you can also on your launch day line up whether it's press, whether it's influencers to recommend it, whether it's a beta, like a huge wait list of beta users. Like launching is so important, and distribution has become so important. And I think that a lot of people don't spend enough time, new podcasters don't spend enough time there. I've seen people who kind of walked into it and said, all right, I've got this show. It's somewhat unique, but how do I make sure the first episode has 1,000 downloads? Not like my, 100th episode. Like, and maybe it's really hard, but like, it's kind of a big challenge to be like, oh, what would have to happen for 1,000 people to download my first episode? And it ends up being like a marketing job, right? Like, how do I do the marketing? How do I do marketing? How do I become a guest on other people's podcasts for a month before my podcast launch or whatever? It's different for everyone. How do I buy ads on Google? I don't know what it is, but I don't think enough people spend a ton of time thinking about that. And they kind of think like, I'm going to launch a podcast and hopefully people find it and listen to it because the content's interesting. I feel like there's some people teaching courses on that, but it's not as much as I would think, because as someone who builds things for people to come use, like it takes a long time to get word of mouth growth. It takes a lot of time to just like pound the pavement. And if you can think about that stuff early, it ends up making a huge difference for the growth curve over time.
Chris Nessie says, I want to more. I think he says, I want to know more about people who are using Podpage in non-traditional ways. What are the best Podpage hacks? This morning, I actually added a quick video about where I just took the front page and almost took the episodes off of it. And you can go in and really customize that. I used a table and put in a couple of different images and links and things like that. So there is some flexibility. Because there are those people that, when you first start off, when I started the School of Podcasting, I was a podcast that had a business. And then probably 10 years in, I flipped it. And now I'm a business that has a podcast. So the podcast helps promote the business. So I really focused on the podcast in the beginning. And so you do have that opinion. You do have that ability to customize the front page. And so that's in the Podpage Facebook group. So if you want to,
I think it's a cool question, because it is a little bit of a hack right now because it's not super obvious. But one of the things that has come up really over the past year has been more and more people. There's two paths. Either you start a podcast and then, I've got a podcast. I really, and it's a good distribution channel for my content, but I also want to have YouTube. I also want to have a newsletter. I also want to have a blog, and Podpage lets you do all that stuff. But maybe eventually you're like, this actually, one of our top users just hacked his Podpage to do this, where he was like, as it turns out, I'm the brand, not the podcast anymore. So I need the website to be about me. And then my podcast is part of my website, but it's not a podcast website. But he has experience with YouTube, and he has experience. I can say it was the podcast. The podcast is called All the Hacks. His name is Chris Hutchins. He was like, I need to go from allthehacks.com to chrishutchins.com. And he's like, and I don't want to go use WordPress. Podpage does. I know that Podpage will do everything for me. I really don't want to have to go and find a different platform. So we sort of hacked with a lot of custom code. He hacked his page together to be not really podcast focused, sort of all content focused. And I hear that a lot more. The other path that people come in is they are a creator and they want to launch a podcast, and they ask around how to do that. And everyone says use Podpage, but they're like, I don't really want to use Podpage for just my podcast because I have all this other content. How do I have more stuff on there? So the idea that Podpage can host a creator's presence and not just their podcast is a very interesting problem that I'm trying to figure out if we can solve in a way that doesn't change Podpage considerably. And Dave was talking about it. It's like there actually are ways you can sort of say, I don't want my podcast episodes on my front page. Just they're all on my episodes page. So I don't need them on my front page. I want my front page to be more about like my holistic offer of being an expert in whatever the field I am is. So we should do once I build a few more things, we should do a whole episode or something on that, because I think it's easier than people think.
Yeah. Neil says, isn't it obvious we should do a podcast SEO podcast? So seeing as we're both experts, I'm not sure if I'm happy with that title for me on SEO. I know a lot about SEO, but because the fun thing is it changes all the time. And he says, now there's no voxelize. I know they disabled their whatever iTunes SEO or Apple SEO. I don't know that Voxelize went out of business though, but I can never say this right. Ashwa are trying to soak up that market. So um, I would just say, I mean, you could use a tool to find your keywords. To me, keywords are keywords or keywords, whether it's in a website or Apple or things like that. Just I always judge my the titles of my episodes of like, is this going to make people click or not? And if I go, well, that one, I want to click that one more, that's the one I use. So I don't know. Do you consider yourself an SEO expert, Brendan?
Well, I think SEO sort of gets conflated with, is it podcast SEO or is it podcast website SEO? Podcast website SEO has a lot to do with you're trying to get people who go to Google to end up on your website. So if you have a website about, I don't know, fly fishing, like how do you optimize the terms you use on your website so when someone searches you on Google, you're the top result? And this actually came up with a podcast not too long ago where the keywords they wanted, their podcast actually was using more like, I think it was fly fishing. They were using the word angler as opposed to fly fishing, something like that. And because they had made that change, they were having a harder time on Google coming up for the word fly fishing because that's just not a word. They actually didn't use that word anywhere on their website. And so, we worked with them to be like, all right, well, you can still have your title of your podcast be about angler, but maybe have fly fishing in your title or, whatever. So that's podcast website SEO. That doesn't really help when it comes to when someone goes to Apple Podcasts and searches you, would you come up first? So I definitely would say that I know a lot about podcast website SEO. And I will say, if that's something you're interested in, if you go to our support.podpage.com and search SEO, we did a 3-part series on SEO for podcasters, specifically the website. It's about 3 hours of content I did with a company called Clarity, which they're SEO specialists. Worth watching if you're interested. A lot of interesting things around like, okay, well, if I have an episode about, heavyweight boxing with a certain, and I'm interviewing a boxer, should I write a blog post about that episode? Does my blog post compete in a Google perspective from my episode? And so a lot of strategies around how to write an accompanying blog post that doesn't compete, but actually drives people to the post and that stuff. So a lot of good content there. I don't know anything about apps or podcast directory SEO though. That's a different thing.
This is an interesting question from Harry. Any plans to pull in Google Analytics so we can see our web traffic on Podpage as opposed to going to Google Analytics, which is a nightmare to navigate? Yes, it is.
There's no real, as far as I know, currently I should look into this again because Google Analytics is now in Google Analytics 4, which it's like every time they release a new one, it's worse than the old one. But it might have some extra ability to pull in data. I want to look into this again. So it is a common complaint. People are like, I want to go to Podpage and see how many people visited my website. And our answer is always just install the Google Analytics tag and go to Google Analytics. The real reason that we've always said that is that as bad as it is, Google Analytics is a pretty sophisticated tool. And I've gone down this road before where it's like, well, we just want something simple. Just give me a simple version of Google Analytics. First of all, building that is time that I could be spending building other podcast website specific features that I think might be more useful. But then also they're like, oh, well, this is cool, but can I also I'm sending UTM parameters through. Can I track where people are coming from? Can I track? And the feature requests just kind of continue down the road of all the features the Google Analytics has. And ultimately, I don't want to build an analytics company. And so that's the main reason that we don't do it, is that it's the same reason everyone wants Podpage to become a podcast host. Because they're like, let me just upload my audio there and you can just be the core place. All the hosting companies are awesome, or not all of them, but a lot of them are great and they're good at it. So, and I'd rather spend time focused really on the problem that we're trying to solve, which is a web presence versus, but I do think that there might be a middle ground for the analytics solution where we can pull in Google Analytics, but then if you want more information, you go over there. So it's a good question. Something I do think about.
And we integrate with, I forget the name of the analytics company. I use Fathom Stats.
Mm-hmm.
And you can use really any, that's the beautiful thing about Podpage is you can really kind of use anything. That was one of the things I learned is hey, can we just embed any iframe? And yeah, pretty much. Because I know when I was using Podia for the School of Podcasting, they limited what you could and couldn't do with a website. And I was really happy that I could do that. So if you have an outside service, that you go into settings, I think it's advanced settings, and you have the boxes where you can put the thing that goes into the header and then the thing that goes in, and you're good to go. So
Well, there's a couple. So for analytics, we do Google Analytics. We also let you do. There's easy integrations with, I think it's called Plausible. I might be wrong.
yes, that's it.
And then there's also Fathom. All three of those are baked in, so you can just go in and enter your ID and it'll just work. We also have an integration Google Tag Manager, which lets you basically put any tag of any kind on your page. So you can do that. And then there's also just a area where you can just put whatever code you want. So there's a bunch of different ways you can use other services. But I think people generally are asking, like, I want to be able to go to podpage.com, log into my dashboard and see how many people visited my website that week. And that's something we don't offer. It's on the list, but there's it keeps getting bumped for things that are more unique to Podpage.
Yeah. And speaking of lists, Dan wants to know, that's not the thing I wanted to click on. I always love that. You have your mouse ready, and then somebody puts one more comment in. Do we have an RSS feed for our blogs on Podpage?
Yep. If you go, let's make a note of this to actually write this in the
dashboard.
If you go to, brendanspodcast.com/blog, I think it's /feed. That's fully available to use.
Excellent. Let's see. A lot of just praise. Chris says, for once, a website builder that has the podcaster in its DNA. Yes. Finally, we can say, get the episode on whatever your website is.com, and we can guide the experience for the listener. Yes.
We can go deeper there. And this comes from feedback from Daniel, from you, and just watching how people did this when we built it. So this is something we literally this morning, I sent Dave a Slack message about, here's how it works. We should probably write it down. But this has been there since week one, because I found that it was what people were doing was, so what I was seeing with people on their websites is, let's say Dave does school podcast episode, 550. So he'd set up the link, or a lot of people would set up the link of like schoolpodcast.com/550. And then your website would come up. And there were two ways people were using this. One way, which is the slug that they always would use, would just be 550. When you went to the website, it would load episode 550, and the location bar would say /550. And that was good because it helps people who are listening remember how to get to the episode on the web. The negative about that is 550 is meaningless to Google. And so some people, I think Dave, you were one of them, would then set up a redirect where it would be like schoolpodcasting.com/550 would then redirect to schoolpodcasting.com/interview with Brendan from Podpage, which is great information that Google can soak up. So from day one, Podpage has had this as a feature where any of your episodes on Podpage, if you've assigned a number to it, if you go to your website.com/number, it will forward it over to you don't have to do anything to set it up. It just automatically works. If you're seasonal, you can type S3E24. It'll take you to the 24th episode of season 3. And so it's stuff like that. I mean, when you talk about Podpage DNA and building a website builder, it's like, you're not going to get that from Squarespace automatically, because they're not focused on, the podcasting format. And so I think there's a lot of that stuff inside Podpage that we should highlight, but it's because of Dave and because of just podcasters in general that those features are there, as opposed to, having to go into Squarespace and go to your redirects page and set one up for every one of your episodes. So,
yeah, awesome. Summer has more wow, it's a big comment. We're completely covered. How about a podcast where each episode tries a different format? That's an interesting thought. Whether interviewing, immersive storytelling, and it's an experimental to discover which format is most intriguing, with a mix of hands-on experiments, out-of-the-box concepts, and live feedback sessions. It would be a dynamic and inspiring space for podcasters eager to push boundaries and explore new horizons in the medium. The way I'm approaching this as a business is, okay, I need to understand who my audience is that would buy Podpage. And if they like that kind of stuff, that makes sense. If they don't, that sounds like a great, almost like a show for like artists that just want to do creative stuff, because it is so outside the box. So usually with a business, I want to do the show like when somebody brought up SEO. Like, I want to do the show that's going to attract my target audience, and people that are into websites, which is what we sell, are into SEO. So that's not a bad comment, but I like the creativity of that. Because again, we go back to, sometimes it's like, what makes your show different? That was really different. So Thanks for the suggestion. I like that idea. But any other questions as we are approaching the 2:00 hour here?
This is just someone who's sort of highlighting why Podpage exists. Essentially, like someone who doesn't really know much about websites, doesn't know much, just wants to make a podcast. But it's like to make in my opinion, every podcast should have a dedicated website. It's just I have a very strong opinion. Obviously, I'm biased, but I have a pretty strong opinion there. And mostly it's because I used to work in the music industry, and it was when MySpace was around. And for a long time, it wasn't very long at all, actually, but for a few years, everyone was like, forget everything except building a fan base on MySpace. That's all people were focused on. I worked for record labels where we would spend a lot of money getting people to go to MySpace and click friends. And because we wanted to have the most friends because that looked good, but also it was a way to communicate with them. So we put all of our time and energy into growing our audience on a platform without realizing that the platform owned the audience, we didn't own the audience. MySpace fell apart, and suddenly the millions of dollars the record labels spent building audiences on that platform, which just went to waste, and we started at zero. And at that point, the industry shifted, and I actually built a website platform for musicians because of this, where it was forget that, get people to a website, get their email address, get a one-to-one relationship with that person, still use the platforms for distribution. And I feel this way about podcasting, still use the platforms for distribution. I listen to everything on Spotify. I don't go to people's websites to listen to the podcasts that I consume, but I find out about them generally on their websites, and I can go to the website and I can write them a note. And I can't do that on Spotify, even though Spotify is trying to add like commenting. And I just think one-to-one relationship with your listeners. And so, Kendra saying like the novice, like a lot of people were too intimidated to create a website because they were just like, I'm a novice, I don't know how to do this, I'll just use Spotify. Like what Podpage is aiming to do is make it, you can just get your website up, you can have a direct relationship with your fans and still use all those other platforms. So it's good to hear that, Kendra.
Chris has a great question here. We have a couple questions coming in. The best way to have our Podpage incorporated into a larger website other than a basic redirect from the main website, what are the pros and cons and best practices?
The overall, so unfortunately, it's really hard to make a website on one service sort of a subdirectory on a website from another service. So if you have a WordPress, davejackson.com is your WordPress site. davejackson.com/podcast would be ideally where your Podpage would be, but it's just very hard to make that work. It's kind of possible, but really not very possible. So the next best option is podcast.davejackson.com, because then you're still telling Google like davejackson.com is like, this is sort of the place where all of my official stuff is. And, a lot of times what you'll end up having is store.davejackson.com, which loads your Teespring store or whatever your host, you're selling stuff. And so that's what a lot of people do. And the worst part about that is if you're on the main website and you click podcast, a lot of times you open up a new tab and you're on Podpage, which looks different. What some people have done, and it does require more custom code, is they've tried to match the Podpage heading design or the navigation bar with their main website. So in Podpage, you can turn on and off all your nav bar links. You can reorder them. And so if your main website says like home, blog, podcast, contact, on Podpage, you can have home actually go to your website homepage. And then you can have blog go to your website blog, because you can just add a link in your Podpage nav bar. Podcast is your podcast page, or your Podpage is podcast page, and then contact can go. You can kind of do that. So it's not perfect, but it's what some people do. Like I said, it's not perfect, but it works pretty much well enough because your end user doesn't feel like their windows are opening, and they're not really looking at the location bar to say like, oh, I was at www.website.com. Now I'm at podcast. So that's the best way to do it now.
Yeah. So Mark, if that didn't answer your question, you'd ask, can you have a unique URL? We just kind of answered that one, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. And I don't know if Mark, when you sign up for Podpage, you get sort of podpage.com/your podcast name, whatever it happens to be. Yeah. You can change that. No one uses that really. Everyone buys goes to Squarespace or GoDaddy and pays $10 to $20 for a domain name and just makes that their podcast or their Podpage name. Yeah, that's better across the board for every reason. It's better to have your own, if nothing else, to start building your own domain authority around your domain name. And full transparency, a lot of podcast hosts will give you a basic website, and a bunch of them let you put a domain name on that basic website, and you should do that. Like that, you should do that immediately. If you're still wondering what to do about your website, just start there. Get your domain and get it on somewhere where you can start building the domain authority.
Yeah. And it's easier to remember. And it, to me, just has this much more of a professional vibe versus, oh yeah, just tell your friends, go to tryandspellthis.podpage.com. I'm like, cause the domain's $20 a year, something like that. So for me, and then Kendra wants to know more. Can I do shameless pimping while we're here, Brendan?
Sure.
Because there's a book. I don't know. Some guy named Dave Jackson wrote a book called Profit from Your Podcast, and available at profitfromyourpodcast.com. The thing I do mention about merchandising, oh, look at that. The thing about merchandising, it's not one of the best ways, but it can be. But it really requires an engaged audience because probably 3% or less of your audience will buy your stuff. But what's fun, what I've seen people that make that work is they'll have like some really talented artist in their audience who will then design a web t-shirt that is some slogan that came out of somebody's mouth, like, whatever it is, like, oh, nobody's going to punch you in the face. Okay. All of a sudden that becomes a t-shirt. And then the key is to make it a limited time only. Like, hey, we've got a new shirt in the store. It's going to be available for the next 3 months, yada, 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 that whole 9 yards. But so it can work, but it's just the problem is especially with t-shirts, is it's hard to find some place that makes a shirt that you would actually want to wear that doesn't feel like sandpaper, and that is then not $18 for you to buy it. And then you want to, like, let's say I want to make $2 a person. Okay, now it's $20, and those places usually charge insane amounts of money for shipping. So all of a sudden your little t-shirt is now $30 for your end user, which is why 3% of the people might buy it, but everybody else is like, I'm not spending $30 on a t-shirt. I don't know. I haven't bought a regular t-shirt in a while, but that's one of those things that can work. It's just I wouldn't lead with that for monetization. It's so there we go.
I remember reading your book when you released it, and I feel like one of the biggest. I mean, this goes for tech products or any product really. I think one of the things that you talked about was you have to be willing to be patient if you're going to start doing any kind of promotion. It typically is not if someone is. If you mentioned Podpage on School Podcasting, it was awesome that you mentioned that episode once. Full transparency, I used to message Dave and say, like, can I please sponsor the School Podcasting? You can never let me do it. But, I feel like you have to really get in front of people multiple times. It can't just be once. I used to make this mistake at the beginning of Podpage where I'd like find a newsletter and I'd be like, hey, I'll sponsor it tomorrow. And they'd be like, oh, where is everyone? And not a lot of people came. And it was like, no, you should sponsor it once a week or once a month or something. So because people need to see your name and your message multiple times before they're going to actually come over. And I feel like you talked about that a little bit in your book, where you're like, if you're going to sponsor a podcast, you should dedicate, you should make sure you have the ability to do that for 4 episodes. I can't remember right off the top of my head what you said, but it was like, don't do it once, do it for, either don't do it or do it for 4 episodes, because it's not going to result in growth if you just do it once.
Yeah, that person's like, I want to sponsor your show once. Like, it's and there are different reports. Some people say you got to hear it at least 7 times. Other people, it's more. It's just one of those things which goes back to why I always recommend having a domain, because the more you say podpage.com, people are going to go, oh, it was podpage.com, and they'll finally remember it. So
I actually think we're at time, so we can wrap up. Yeah. I always talk about this at Podcast Evolutions with some podcasters this past year. Was I think one of the best examples of a podcaster that tries to deliver value to the sponsors is Tim Ferriss. If you go to his website, which is a WordPress website, and I can't remember what the link is, but somewhere on there it says sponsor the show. He's very, very blunt about what it is. I think it leads you to a Wufoo form. If you ever want to know about, like, does all my stuff need to be perfectly look gorgeous and work perfectly and be integrated, go to Tim's site and you will see that no, you don't need any of that stuff. He uses the most basic shit. he puts like Wufoo forms up. He puts his website looks like it was created. I mean, it was created like 20 years ago. He's never really updated the design. It just works. It's sort of like Amazon is an ugly site, but it works so well that they don't change it. Tim knows how to optimize stuff, and he will list how much it costs to sponsor his episodes, and it is very expensive. I'm talking like it's like $40,000 an episode to sponsor his thing.
Wow.
But in there, he talks about if you want to sponsor, you have to apply. They will review it, and they don't accept sponsors that they don't think they can deliver $40,000 of value back. Meaning, if he doesn't think he can help you sell that much in whatever you're trying to sell, they won't even do it. Because what's important to Tim is that you not only sponsor it, but you have such a good experience that you keep sponsoring it. And so I feel like it's a really interesting page because he talks about, I think you have to sponsor at least 2 episodes, but he says sponsors that don't do X amount of episodes will not be successful, so we don't take them. And it kind of feels like when you're reading it, you could interpret it as like cash grabby, like he's trying to screw you over. But if you read the whole thing, it's very well articulated. Like, we've designed sponsorships. They're expensive, but the reason that we have the same sponsors for many years is because they're so successful. But you have to be targeting our audience. And here's what he puts details about what his audience is. Like, and they do like studies every 6 to 12 months about making sure it's all up to date. He's like, here's how many percentage are women. Here's how many percentage are men. Here's how old they are. Here's what their interests are. And if you are focusing on that, you'll be really successful. But if I tried to sell Podpage to his audience, it would be a total waste of money. And he would never take me as a person because I would walk away with a bad experience. Anyway, I'm now like, we're talking about profiting from your podcast. I think that he's intentionally, I mean, he's got the ability to do this because he has such a big audience, but he's basically saying like, we won't take anyone's money. We're only going to take your money if we can make you successful. And I think it's a really good strategy for people. To come out. I used to say to people who wanted for Podpage to sponsor their episode, I said, well, I'm not trying to be rude, but like sign up as an affiliate, pretend I'm sponsoring, send traffic. You're going to get paid. We have a really good affiliate program. You're going to get paid more than I think they were asking to sponsor. I was like, if you can start driving traffic, then I'll give you whatever money you want because you can show that this is going to work for your audience. So anyway, we can do a whole episode on this stuff. But when you bring out that book, I always think like everyone always wants to monetize quickly. And it's like, well, the important thing about monetization, like the important thing about advertising and sponsorships is those people are successful. They'll keep coming back if they're successful. So
that's it. I did want to answer, and then we do have to leave here. Somebody answered, I forget who it was, but we got an active chat room. And the book I mentioned earlier is called The Audience is Listening by Tom Webster. And I think in chapter 5 at this point. So good stuff. But thanks to everyone for coming out. And we will, again, when you go into Podpage, well, first of all, podpage.com/community, join the community. And when you're in Podpage, if you go up to the help menu, you'll see the links that Brendan mentioned about how to get more help and future webinars and such like that. And we will see you again soon. And as always, if you have any feedback on anything Podpage related, we're always open to any kind of feedback to make it better. So, Brendan, anything else you want to throw in?
No, I just put the link to Tim's page. It literally is a Wufoo form still, and it has all that information on it. So I think it's a good, you just move the zero, you move the decimal point over maybe 4 digits for your site, but you can see what works for someone who's been doing this a long time and has been really good at it. So thank you, everyone. Welcome, Dave. This has been fun. I like Rob's suggestion of maybe just doing something like this in addition. We don't want to overload people with live Q&As and office hours and all, but so we're still trying to figure out, it'll take us a while to figure out what the mix is, but this is definitely, this has been really fun. So we should do this more often.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll see you.